300,000. That's not a projection. That's not a 5-year plan written by a ministry that will be reshuffled before anyone checks the results. That's how many semiconductor technicians China trained, certified, and placed into active manufacturing roles in a single calendar year. 300,000 people who now know how to operate, maintain, or engineer the equipment inside a chip fabrication facility. Meanwhile, the United States Senate is still arguing about whether a workforce development bill deserves a subcommittee hearing. I want you to sit with that contrast for a moment, not the politics of it, not the ideology, just the operational reality. One country looked at its chip shortage and said, "We need human infrastructure at scale, and we need it now." The other looked at the same shortage, commissioned a report, formed a task force, released a white paper, and scheduled a follow-up discussion for next quarter. This is what falling behind actually looks like. Not a dramatic moment. Not a Sputnik event with a clear villain and a clear response. It looks like bureaucratic inertia running on one side and institutional velocity running on the other, until one morning you check the numbers and the gap is no longer closable within a political cycle. Here's what makes this particular number matter beyond the headline. Semiconductor manufacturing is not an industry you can staff with enthusiasm. You can't take a motivated 22-year-old, run them through a 6-week boot camp, hand them a badge, and put them inside a clean room that costs $4 billion to build. The knowledge is tacit. It lives in hands, in pattern recognition, in the kind of judgment that only comes from watching a process fail 1,000 times and learning what it felt like before it failed. Building that workforce takes years, and that's before you account for specialization. Photolithography technicians are not the same as chemical-mechanical planarization specialists. Etch engineers don't automatically cross over into deposition. The pipeline is long and the branching is real. China understood this before TSMC opened its first Arizona building. The Ministry of Education, working alongside the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, began redesigning vocational and university-level semiconductor curricula as early as 2020. Not as a response to U.S. sanctions, as preparation for them. They weren't reacting, they were pre-positioning. The CHIPS and Science Act passed in 2022 with genuine bipartisan support, a real achievement in a Congress that can't agree on the color of the sky. It allocated $52 billion for semiconductor manufacturing and research, and tucked inside it was language about workforce development. Good language, actually. Thoughtful. It identified the gap accurately. And then it met the American implementation machine, which has a remarkable ability to turn urgency into process, and process into delay. As of the most recent GAO review, the workforce pipeline programs funded under CHIPS remain significantly undersubscribed. Not because Americans don't want these jobs, the pay is good, the demand is real, the career path is stable, but because the community college partnerships are still being negotiated, because the apprenticeship frameworks haven't cleared the relevant regulatory bodies, because 11 different federal agencies have a piece of this, and getting 11 agencies to move in the same direction at the same speed is, how do I put this charitably, not America's strongest institutional capability. 300,000 in 1 year. That number isn't just a data point, it's a signal about organizational culture, about what a country does when it decides something is serious versus when it decides something is important. Those two words are not synonyms. Important things get mentioned in speeches. Serious things get funded, staffed, and tracked weekly by someone whose career depends on the outcome. There's a harder question underneath all of this, and we'll get to it, because the raw number of trained technicians isn't the whole story. What matters is what they're being trained to do, on what equipment, for what nodes. That's where this gets genuinely complicated. There's a city in Jiangsu province called Wuxi that most Western analysts don't spend much time on. It doesn't have the profile of Shenzhen. It doesn't appear in the semiconductor headlines the way Shanghai does. But Wuxi is where SK Hynix runs one of its largest DRAM facilities outside Korea, And more relevantly, it's where a cluster of Chinese vocational institutions have been running what amounts to a live apprenticeship pipeline directly into active fabs. Students rotate through real cleanroom environments before they graduate, not simulations, not training labs with decommissioned equipment, actual production floors under supervision on tools that are making chips that will ship. That model, call it embedded vocational integration, is now being replicated across 14 other Chinese cities with significant semiconductor manufacturing presence. The blueprint came partly from Taiwan. Anyone who has studied how TSMC built its workforce over 3 decades recognizes the logic: compress the distance between classroom and cleanroom until the boundary between them nearly disappears. America's version of this, historically, has been the 4-year university track. You study electrical engineering or materials science, you graduate, you get hired, and then the company trains you on their specific process. That worked well enough when American fabs were the dominant employers and the knowledge transfer happened organically inside the industry. It doesn't work as well when you're trying to build workforce capacity from near zero in a compressed timeline, which is precisely the situation TSMC, Arizona, Intel, Ohio, and Samsung, Texas, all find themselves in right now. TSMC has been public about this in ways that are uncomfortable if you read the primary statements rather than the summaries. In 2023 testimony and in subsequent interviews, company representatives cited workforce readiness as the primary reason for delaying Arizona's first advanced node production. Not permitting, not equipment delivery, people. Specifically, the gap between the technical culture required to run a leading-edge fab at yield and what was available in the local labor market. TSMC's solution, importing experienced engineers from Taiwan on temporary work arrangements, drew political criticism and missed the point simultaneously. The criticism was about jobs. The point was about knowledge. You cannot will a workforce into existence by signing a bill. China's approach has a different problem, and this is where I'll complicate the picture slightly, because the 300,000 number deserves scrutiny before it becomes gospel. A significant portion of those trained technicians are being prepared for mature node manufacturing, 28 nanometer and above. SMIC's primary production volume still lives in that range. The advanced node pipeline, the 7 nanometer equivalent work that made headlines in 2023 with Huawei's Mate 60 Pro, draws on a much smaller, much more specialized cohort. Building that cohort is harder, slower, and more dependent on equipment access, which is exactly where U.S. export controls have had genuine, measurable effect. So the honest version of this story has 2 tracks. On mature nodes, the chips that go into cars, appliances, industrial equipment, the vast majority of electronics that actually run the physical world, China is building workforce depth that will make it largely self-sufficient within this decade. On leading-edge nodes, the picture is murkier. The talent exists in smaller numbers. The equipment constraints are real, and the gap between having trained technicians and having technicians who can push a process node to its physical limits is significant. But here's what the 2-track analysis misses if you stop there. Mature node dominance is not a consolation prize. Roughly 70% of global semiconductor revenue by volume, not by value, but by units shipped, comes from chips that don't require cutting-edge lithography. The automotive sector, industrial controls, defense electronics at the component level, medical devices, these run on 28 nanometers and older. If China locks in workforce and manufacturing dominance at that tier, it controls the supply chain for most of the physical infrastructure that the modern world depends on. The geopolitical leverage in that position is not hypothetical. The American strategic conversation has been almost entirely fixated on the leading edge, on 3 nanometers, on EUV, on the race that TSMC and Samsung are running at the frontier. That focus is not wrong, but it has created a blind spot the size of the industrial economy. We'll come back to that number from the opening, 300,000, because in part 3, it lands differently than it did here. Let me argue against myself for a moment, because the case I've been building deserves a real challenge before it gets a verdict. The counter-argument runs like this. Workforce numbers are an input metric, not an output metric. Training 300,000 technicians means nothing if the fabs they staff can't access the equipment needed to run competitive processes. China's semiconductor ambitions are real, but they remain bottlenecked at the tooling layer, and that bottleneck is structural, not temporary. ASML's EUV machines, the ones required for sub-7 nanometer production, are still blocked from export to China under Dutch and American pressure. Applied Materials, Lam Research, KLA, the American equipment trinity that underlies process control at every serious node, are operating under increasingly tight license restrictions. You can train 1 million technicians, the argument goes, and they'll still be standing in front of tools they can't fully optimize because the most capable tools aren't allowed in the building. That argument is correct, and it's also, I think, roughly 4 years behind where the situation actually is. Here's the reframe. The export control logic assumes that equipment access is a permanent ceiling. What it underestimates is that equipment dependency is itself an engineering problem, and China has now directed serious institutional resources at solving it as an engineering problem rather than accepting it as a political constraint. Huawei's HiSilicon division didn't disappear after the 2020 Entity List designation. It went quiet, then it went deep. The Mate 60 Pro chip, fabbed by SMIC on a process node that most Western analysts said wasn't accessible to them, didn't emerge from nowhere. It emerged from years of process innovation that found workarounds for missing tooling, multi-patterning techniques, modified deposition sequences, yield management approaches that compensated for equipment gaps with process ingenuity. That kind of innovation doesn't happen without people who understand the process at a level below the equipment manual. It happens because someone in a clean room in Shanghai spent 5 years learning exactly where a tool's limitations were and started asking what happened if you approached the same problem from the material side instead of the lithography side. That person exists because China decided years ago that workforce depth was infrastructure. Now here's the data point that should reframe everything I said. The 300,000 figure covers a single year. The cumulative pipeline China has been building since the Made in China 2025 initiative formalized semiconductor self-sufficiency as a national priority, represents something closer to 1.2 million trained or in-training semiconductor workers across the full spectrum, from equipment maintenance to process engineering to fab management. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency published an internal workforce assessment in late 2023 that estimated the U.S. would need approximately 70 to 90,000 additional skilled semiconductor workers to fully staff the fabs currently under construction under CHIPS Act funding. 70 to 90,000. Against a Chinese pipeline 12 times that size. The ratio is the argument. And this is where the anger, mine at least, stops being about China and starts being about the specific texture of American institutional failure. Because this wasn't unforeseeable. The National Science Foundation has been publishing data on declining American undergraduate enrollment in materials science and semiconductor-adjacent engineering disciplines since 2015. The Semiconductor Industry Association released a workforce gap report in 2021 that used almost exactly the numbers the GAO would later confirm. The information existed. The diagnosis was accurate. The response was a bill that took 2 years to pass, spawned 11 overlapping implementation bureaucracies, and still hasn't produced a functioning national apprenticeship framework. There is a particular kind of failure that isn't dramatic enough to generate accountability. Nobody loses an election over slow workforce pipeline development. Nobody gets fired for a subcommittee that met 4 times and produced a framework document. The consequences are diffuse, they're delayed, and by the time they're undeniable, the people who made the decisions are no longer in the rooms where the decisions get made. China's system has its own failure modes. Over-centralization, credential inflation, the risk that 300,000 trained technicians is partly a number that looks good in a ministry report rather than a workforce that shows up as productive capacity. I'm not dismissing those risks, but institutional failure with momentum is recoverable. Institutional failure with inertia is a different problem entirely. The last open loop closes. The question isn't whether America can close the gap. The question is whether closing it still matters in the way we think it does. There's a version of this story that ends with a call to action. Fund the programs, pass the frameworks, build the pipelines, and America's semiconductor workforce catches up within a decade. That version is technically possible. I don't find it particularly convincing, and I'll tell you why. Workforce gaps don't close linearly. They compound. Every year that Chinese fabs run with fully staffed, experienced teams, those teams get better. The tacit knowledge accumulates. The process intuition deepens. The senior engineers who joined in 2020 are now mentoring the cohort that joined in 2023, who will mentor the cohort joining now. That compounding is invisible in the headline numbers, but it's the actual asset being built. You cannot close a compounding knowledge gap by matching the input numbers at a later date. You close it by starting earlier than you did, which is a move that is, by definition, no longer available. What's still available is more interesting than the catch-up narrative anyway. The CHIPS Act fabs are real. They're being built. Intel's Ohio facility, TSMC's second Arizona fab, Samsung's expansion in Taylor, Texas. These are physical facts now, not policy proposals. The equipment is being installed. The question was never really whether America could build the buildings. It's whether the buildings will run at the yields and the throughputs that make them economically and strategically meaningful. And that question is entirely a workforce question. One thing I keep returning to, the most important number in semiconductor manufacturing isn't the node size on the marketing slide. It's yield, the percentage of chips on a wafer that actually work. Yield is where process knowledge lives. A fab running at 60% yield on a leading-edge node is an expensive building. A fab running at 85% yield on that same node is a strategic asset. The difference between those two numbers is almost entirely human. It's the accumulated judgment of engineers and technicians who have run the process enough times to feel where it wants to drift before the metrology data confirms it. TSMC's Arizona fabs are currently running below Taiwan yield benchmarks. TSMC has said this publicly, carefully, in language that is diplomatic but unambiguous. They are working on it. The gap will narrow. But the timeline for narrowing it is measured in years of operational experience, not in training cohorts or policy frameworks. This is the part of the semiconductor story that doesn't fit neatly into a political speech, because the honest version requires admitting that even with the right investments made today, the return is slow, uncertain, and dependent on human factors that no legislation can directly accelerate. My prediction, and I'll stake something on this, by 2028, China will be the dominant global supplier of mature node semiconductors by volume, not because of any single policy victory, but because workforce depth combined with equipment domestication at that tier will have crossed a threshold of self-sufficiency that makes the current sanctions architecture largely irrelevant for everything below 14 nanometers. The leading edge will remain contested longer, but the leading edge is not where most of the world's chips come from. The more uncomfortable prediction is this. The United States will still be running its advanced fabs at partial capacity in 2027, constrained not by funding or equipment, but by the workforce gap that was visible in 2021, documented in 2022, legislated around in 2022, and inadequately addressed through 2025. Not because the people making decisions are stupid. Many of them are genuinely capable and genuinely alarmed, but because the institutional machinery between alarm and outcome in the American system has a latency that strategic competition doesn't wait for. 300,000 technicians in 1 year. That number from the opening, here's where it actually lands. It's not impressive because it's large. It's significant because it represents a decision made 4 years ago. executed through institutions that were built for exactly this kind of sustained, unsexy, unglamorous capacity building. The decision preceded the number by years, which means the number we'll be talking about in 2027 was decided in 2023. And on one side of the Pacific, that decision looks like it's been made. If this raised questions you hadn't thought to ask before, that's the point. Share it with someone who thinks the CHIPS Act solved this. And if you want to know what happens when China applies the same workforce logic to the one domain where America still holds a commanding lead, that video is coming.